Nikolas Weinstein went from a glassblower making tabletop sculptures to the architect of multi-story glass constructions that twist and turn at monumental scale. Learn about Nikolas's journey, how he figured out ways to turn simple borosilicate rods into the largest glass sculptures ever made, in this episode of Glass Quarterly Live. From the Brooklyn, New York studios of Urban Glass, this is Glass Quarterly Live, where we take a deep dive into the latest edition of Glass Magazine with exclusive interviews with featured artists. I'm your host, Andrew Page, the editor of Glass, and we're very pleased to have Nikolas Weinstein with us for this, the third edition of Glass Quarterly Live. So, Nikolas, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so pleased to have you, and we're so grateful for you making some time for us today from, I'm sure, your incredibly busy schedule. So welcome to Glass Quarterly Live.
Thank you.
Great. We are on the cover of this issue, and we've had a chance to, discuss in the process of researching and writing that piece. I wanted to talk a little bit about your biography, like where this all started and how, your own journey. Obviously you grew up in New York City, and you are somebody who was born to quite creative parents. I understand that your father had been in the city planning, urban planning area, working for the city planning, I guess, the Commission of New York City.
Yeah, he was in charge of Lower Manhattan under Lindsay.
Okay. And then he later went on to California, where he became the dean of the graduate architecture program and urban planning as well at UCLA. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How old were you? Did you guys all move to LA at that point?
No, that happened pretty much as I went off to college.
I see. Okay. So, yeah. So your mother is also a creative person, and she had a career as a sculptor for a while. Is that correct?
Yeah, early on, she did sculpture at Bennington, and worked a bit with Tony Smith.
Oh, wow.
And then had children.
Uh-huh. Well, it sounds like you are a product of both of those aspects. I mean, your dad's architectural, career and academic career and in city planning, but certainly it sounds like he had a strong technical basis for his architectural work. And then your mother, obviously, from the sculptor. It seems in some ways like it's very fitting that your parents, like you embody sort of aspects of both. It sounds like, as somebody who solves major technical problems, as we'll discover in this conversation today. I mean, one of the aspects of your practice that's just awe-inspiring is just being able to manage and have outcomes of work with the scale and complexity of what we'll learn about in this conversation today, or for those who have read the article, have some idea about. And also, of course, the incredible expressive nature of your works that have, they're really like an incredible marriage of, sculpture and construction and logistics, and all of those things come into play. So I'm not, it's not completely surprising that your parents represent both of those, all of those things in their own careers. So you went to, as far as education goes, you mentioned you went off to college. You ended up at Brown, right, in Providence. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah. And you did not study glass at Brown?
No, I started at Oberlin, then I spent some time in Europe studying there, and then I had some free time, worked at a stained glass shop in Brooklyn. I was just looking for a weird job. I hated it. I got interested in hot glass just because I figured there's got to be something more captivating about it. And I actually took a couple of lessons down at the New York Experimental Glass Workshop back when it was in Little Italy.
Yeah, and an interesting small world note is that New York Experimental evolved into Urban Glass, and so you meet again with New York Experimental in its latest iteration. Yeah,
I'm sure I'm going to destroy her name, but Deborah
Teresco.
Yeah, she was my teacher.
Great. Yeah.
But I only did a couple of things, and then I went off to Brown. I did my comparative literature course of study, and essentially I finished all my credits early, and so I went back to RISD for a glass blowing class in my last semester at Brown.
So you had already some knowledge about glass from your stained glass job that you hated, but also from your glass blowing experiences at New York Experimental. Yeah.
Yeah, meager.
Meager. Okay, so you had we know I know this from our interview and for the magazine. You had mentioned you found yourself in a glass blowing class with Michael Shiner
Yep.
at RISD, and he gave you a prompt. He gave a whole class a prompt, which was to come up with an idea for something organic, right?
Right.
And I
Yeah.
appreciate, yeah. I was surprised because when we talked earlier, you mentioned, like, you were studying comp lit, right? So I was thinking, like, it would seem almost expected that you would come up with something, very, intricate or at least conceptually, far reaching. And in fact, you said you came up with something, you really were drawn to the idea of a really organic form. Yeah.
Yeah, no, straight ahead. I think what I mentioned to you was I just remember this so clearly. One person took 3 glass milk jars like that used to get deliveries in, and one had milk, one had urine, one had blood.
Yeah.
They took it in this completely, probably more comp lit, symbiotics kind of vein. I just made a gourd. I took it very literal about it. And quite honestly, uh, I still feel the same about most of what I do. There's not a great conceptual enterprise at work. I mean, it gets very complex, and I think about it a lot in the abstract, but the focus of it is really just about expressing movement and form, and it's really not much more complicated than that.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about this. This is not right out of college. Obviously, you worked and you continued to refine this form. You stayed with glass, interestingly. I believe first simply repairing stained glass for when you stayed in Providence, where there was sort of these transoms over doorways that would often get cracked because they were historic homes, and you had that experience from the stained glass. But then you also, it sounds like, stayed in the hot shop in a way and explored this form of organic expressions of molten glass in a mold. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically, glass blowing, as people might know, takes a lot of practice, and I very
Hmm.
quickly sort of realized that what I wanted to make and what I had the skills to make were sort of apart. And on some level, because I had initially started the glass blowing doing mold blown stuff, it kind of gave me a way to sculpt something in the mold indirectly and sort of still be able to fundamentally shape the glass. So I started
Hmm.
working with other people who had those chops, and
Hmm.
I could work on these molds, and they would help me blow into them, and then I could grab them and stretch them and do all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that really informed most of the way I worked. So early on, yeah, I was doing some stained glass to make a little money, but on the side, I was still running with this idea of like, oh, I'll just keep doing the mold thing because I can start to make what I have in my head, even though I
Hmm.
don't have the hands for it yet. And so
Mm.
that kind of
Mm.
collaborative way of working, which is so fundamental to glass blowing, sort of really stuck with me, but in a very direct way with these molds. So
You know,
these were the first kinds of things I made.
yeah.
Um, and
I will note though that like, as you say, you're so modest about, obviously, you weren't able to free blow or at that point to the degree that you would have liked. But I will say that though, like as structures, I mean, like your study of organic shape is already evident. I mean, in this, it's so interesting because what's authentically organic is often symmetry with imperfection, right? And it seems like you already were exploring this in interesting ways, even highlighting it with the translucence to the color. You already sort of very curious, clearly in studying, what reads as organic and the complexity of organic form.
yeah, and I now default to no color,
Hmm.
just because I find it can pick up all the surrounding colors more exactly. But also, even here, I was just more interested in the shape. And one thing as you were talking that occurred to me is like, even though the work now looks very different in some ways, it's still fundamentally grounded in this kind of the workflow of the mold blown stuff because I'm like in any project, I usually end up, I end up working with models and stuff, and I keep going until I arrive at some kind of response to the space. that's essential in some ways, that you can kind of pare it down and describe it as a fundamental DNA of sorts. And you know, where, okay, so the construction is always a herringbone pattern at 30 degrees, and it's, you know, an accordion fold, and they're connected this way. And you can describe all the parameters of the forms. That those in many ways are the same as the molds, where you sort of, you establish some critical qualities to the constructions, the way they're put together and what they look like. And then you play with them. You know, I can go this way, I can go that way, I can make it taller, I can make it shorter. And you know, when I blow into a mold, usually that's what those pieces were about, was like, if you have one question, the mold, how many answers can you get out of it? And in the modern pieces, like even the most recent piece, you know, in Manila,
Hmm.
or the Berlin piece that you just briefly
Yeah.
showed,
Hmm.
those
Yeah.
are all sort of taking one construction and playing with different expressions of it, bigger, smaller, how they relate to each other, but they're all essentially the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I put this slide next partly because I like the segue from that particular image to this one. But this is like the big moment in your career. You had been selling these objects through a design, sort of high-end design art galleries in stores, right? Like including Japanese high-end department store, and then later that buyer moved on to Barney's, New York, a very luxury name in
Yep.
retail, you know, sort of a legendary retailer where they sold a lot of interior design as well as, of course, the most fashionable clothing. And apparently, one day you said you got a phone call from the office or from Frank Gehry himself, the famous architect. Can you tell me a
Yeah,
little bit about that? Yeah.
yeah, it was definitely out of the blue. It was, they weren't the blown pieces, but he had seen you know, one of the slightly more abstract, non-functional. I know most of them don't look terribly functional, but you could imagine that you could put flowers in them or something like that. Whereas this
Mm-hmm.
piece, I didn't pay any attention to that. And he had seen that, and he was very intrigued, and he was just beginning to work on this project in in Berlin for bank headquarters. And it had one of the main public spaces was the one you're seeing in front of you, which is where they
Yeah.
had conferences and lectures and presentations, and they were looking for something to put in there to kind of give it a little bit of local character. And Yeah, and that's how I got involved. I had never done anything even remotely approaching the scale, but in that respect, he was spectacularly trusting.
Yeah. So I mean, like that's like an incredible story. And I remember from our interview earlier, sorry, where we were talking about you know, just that you knew immediately blown glass was not going to work. This is not blown glass, obviously, what we're seeing
But
here. And you knew immediately that it wasn't going to work as blown glass. So you had to completely re-engineer your process. At the same time, you know, as having this great opportunity, you also had this incredible challenge. And you were pressed to not say, oh, sorry, blown glass won't work, but here's an alternative. I mean, obviously, who gets an opportunity like that? I mean, who would actually say, like, sorry, Mr. Gehry, I cannot make something big enough out of mold blown glass,
well,
right? So yeah, yeah.
that was an option. I mean, I, when I say I really had no idea how I was going to do it, I mean that truthfully. And you know, that's something I've, people who know me well know that I kind of gravitate to risk.
Hmm.
And this was certainly one of those cases where I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do it. I knew that blown glass, at least the way I thought about things, was not viable. Too intensive, too, even if you blew it really thin, just structurally non-viable. Um, and I also knew that if I just used plate glass, it would just look like a bunch of big slumped sheets. So
Right, right.
you know, it began with that kind of like, how the hell am I going to find enough material? That was the other thought, like, how the hell could you blow this much glass? I mean, other people have done that and they glom it together to make a big thing, but then it just looks like a bunch of glass aggregated, you know? And so initially it was just like, where in industry can I find a lot of material that I can work with, you know, make mistakes, do it again, and really build something of scale. And that was the glass tube, because
Hmm.
it was light, and it was strong, which is the same reason why they use tubes in metal, you know, that structurally
Right.
they're almost as strong as solid rods, but they weigh a lot less. So,
And they also use those rods in very important like medical equipment, right? They use the borosilicate rods because of their durability and in some type of suction device that's required to keep somebody alive, right? Um, I love the story that you told me about. You finally had a prototype, one of the something, an early version of these, obviously, and you were rushing to the office, so excited to share with the Frank Gehry team, and you banged it, and
well,
it cracked.
close.
Yeah.
I in working with Frank's office, they hooked me up with some engineers that they had worked with, a guy named Michael Mulhern at Tri-Pyramid Structures, who does very specialized glass connection systems, mostly architectural kind of spaces. And he was in town, and so I was going to meet him and his
Right.
colleague from Arup, who was head of their materials division, or on his way to being that. At the time, we were both pretty young. I was 26. He was maybe a year or two older. And I was
Hmm.
rushing to go meet them. And yes, the piece that I had, the sample where I sort of fused together these tubes into this bent kind of honeycomb, was damaged. And I was sheepish about it because here I was meeting these, quote unquote professionals. And I was like, I'm going to build this big thing of overseas. And I couldn't even pull off the sample.
Yeah.
But
And
so
you thought about not actually showing up, right?
I
Did it
don't know if
cross your mind like, okay.
I don't know if I thought about not going. I was just really flustered. I felt stupid.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and no, they got, and particularly Graham, the guy from Arup, got very interested in it. Not that it was broken, but the way in which it broke. And inadvertently, I kind of happed upon a construction that didn't allow cracks to propagate, right? So kind of the fundamental law of cracks is they will run, whether it's now or eventually, until they relieve all their stress. And normally, if you have a single body, that means the thing was going to get cleaved in two or whatever. And what
Right.
eventually done is created a structure where there were so many multiple connections that they could support the whole construction without having sort of catastrophic failure, right? So, everyone
Yeah.
helped hold up would help to hold the broken tube together. And, that's really in glass safety, that's not all, but it's a lot of the game, especially with big windows. Either they're laminated so that they slump in their window frame, and so you can take them out and manage the condition, or tempered glass, they explode into small enough pieces that it's not a problem. These did neither thing, but they still didn't allow the thing to fail catastrophically. And that's the only reason why we were able to build that project.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd imagine it also fit a bit with the ethos. I mean, at the time, right? This is the late 1990s. Gary's work was just becoming possible thanks to technology and things that enabled him to design the way he was designing buildings that people had never seen before. So you were probably in, like it wasn't like you were going to an architecture firm that was like, had a set idea. Like you were
No,
going someplace that they were ready for new things, and so in your own a fear that you were bringing something that might compromise your contract with these people, you actually ended up giving them something that got super exciting to them, right? As its durability
yeah,
was
and it
proven
wasn't.
in a way. Yeah.
I should be. He was great. They were great. I think that more than anything, he seemed to be a big believer in go, figure it out, come back to me when you got something. They weren't coddling me. They weren't nervously sort of, they should have been nervously managing me, but he really gave me a lot of rope. And,
Yeah.
like a good example of this was I went down there and I had like, for the first big presentation, I had 2 or 3 models, and I kind of worked, well, yeah, I thought about doing this, and I went through the whole explanation. Then I showed him another one. It was just me and him hanging out in the room. Here's another way of doing it. And I was going through this whole rigmarole, and he was like, stop. Like, which is the one? And I said, that one, the third one, right? The build up. And he was like, okay, do that one. That was
Wow.
it. We left.
Yeah. Wow.
The whole presentation out the window.
Right.
But it was clear to him that I was kind of justifying and explaining, and he was just like, which one is it? Just cut to the chase. And
Yeah.
that's mostly what working with him was like. I mean, I didn't have deep, long conversations. It was more just about like he invested a huge amount of trust in me. And
Yeah.
then let me hang myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talk about a big break. I mean, this is really an incredible, opportunity. And then you were like, not just any architect, it was the architect who was on the brink himself of changing architecture, right? Your dad must have been impressed with that. I don't know if he was a fan of Gehry or not, but I'm sure that was, a nice sort of opportunity that obviously wasn't easy. You told me it was many years in the to solve it and to actually construct the pieces is incredibly costly for you because you were developing the technology to make these types of work possible, which required incredible investments in kilns and in ideas, and prototypes that didn't work out, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, now that I'm an old man, that's what youth affords, right? Don't
Yeah.
you don't know how over the edge you really are. And if you could fully appreciate the consequences of all the steps and decisions, you wouldn't try a lot of it, or a lot of people wouldn't try a lot of it. And
Hmm.
I think that whole experience and way of working uh, has become very fundamental, or I'm a lot more. I guess I'd say I'm a little bit more comfortable going places where I can't sort of envision exactly how you get out of it. Like, it made me comfortable with the idea that you could embark on a project where you couldn't quite figure out how the hell you were going to solve it, but you just had to have a faith, a trust, and that you would find your way through. And time and again, there's always a new pickle, but you can always find your way out. It's just not sometimes it's just really not obvious for a very long time, and it's nerve-wracking, but you'll find
Yeah.
through.
Well, this is, I think, a good place to look at the way technology works in your practice. And you in addition to an interest in art, obviously, and in glass, you also had this abiding interest in technology. You told me in our interview that computers. You were always like somebody who had the earliest iteration of new devices. You were into tinkering and engineering, and very key to all this is I think that you moved to this from the East Coast to the West Coast, specifically to the Bay Area, where not only Silicon Valley was happening in the 90s in terms of all the kind of Apple and the groundwork in Microsoft, but also there was so much military and space research historically in this area that it was just teeming with a certain type of person, out of Stanford University, but also just out of engineering and research and aviation. There was so much going on that the climate was unique, and actually tinkering was also, I think you were drawn as well to people who were just doing really offbeat things. I mean, obviously there was the military industrial complex or Silicon Valley, but there was also this kind of wild thing that was going on that led to what we might now think of as Burning Man or Robot Wars, both of which derived from members of this group called Survival Research Labs, which was based in San Francisco, which I imagine you may be familiar with from your time there.
Yeah, I've gone to a bunch of their shows. They
Okay.
were great. They were crazy. They were unhinged. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm still close with a couple of the guys who worked on the shows. They were fantastic. I mean, the one thing in describing the Bay Area that I think you covered a lot of the critical, components, but one thing was, in some respects, they didn't have a lot of money yet. I mean, it was certainly a wealthy American city, but it still had there was still fat in the system. There was room to
Hmm.
experiment because everything wasn't so precious.
Right.
And so I think that's a key component, is like, these guys could just go to a junkyard and find, old military elements and combine them, or
Yeah.
steal them, or however they came by them. When things get a lot more fully expressed and professionalized, there's not as much room for people just kind of winging it.
Right.
And
Well,
that was, at that time, there was, someone could imagine just trying stuff, and if it didn't work, it wasn't that big a deal. Whereas now, right, the danger in those kinds of markets, and this happens everywhere, is that if it gets too expensive, then people get nervous about trying something.
right. Right.
That's the death knell, right? And then when
Yeah.
everything becomes so expensive that no one's willing to, like, just open a restaurant and see how it goes, you know?
Right, right. Well, I'm not playing this video clip, which I have queued up because it is rather loud, as you said. So I did thought it might be difficult to talk over, but I'll just show a we have a jet engine strapped to a bike here, yeah, or some type of go-kart, jet-powered go-kart, yeah. So you get the idea, I mean, not to belabor the point, but I mean, clearly there was a lot of experimental activity and energy going around, which is something that, when we talked for the magazine article, you were saying it's quite intoxicating for you to be in that environment, in addition to your business and design and making these tabletop sculptures. And, you were also kind of hanging out and getting inspired a bit by these guys. So when the Frank Gehry project came along, you kind of were in the perfect place and maybe even in the perfect mentality for approaching glass in a way that nobody had ever really thought of before. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about what we're looking at in this slide.
Sure. So this is the first kiln I ever sort of designed. It was for the Berlin project, and without going too deeply into it, the one of the main problems with that was we'd get a whole bunch of these tubes together on a flat surface. You'd heat them up until they just began to stick together, but they didn't get so hot that they would collapse and lose their hollows, which was important for their structural integrity, so that they were a honeycomb. And then you'd have to anneal that, and then it wasn't until you then put that into some kind of a mold and bent it that it gained a lot of its structure. If you think of a flat sheet of paper, it's very easy to wiggle, but as soon as you work a curve into it, it resists being deformed in certain aspects. So in this kind of intermediate state, it was very fragile. And so what this kiln did, because the big problem was when I really kind of started to figure out how the hell you'd build this thing. And I started to sort of map out how long it would take to sort of do this first firing, let it cool, then set up another mold, and then do a second. There was no way I was ever going to pull it off. And then I'd have a whole studio full of these car-sized, unique molds. Like, it just didn't make any sense. And so I over dinner one night, I don't know why, but I thought of those 70s pin models that you put your hand into that your parents had on their coffee table. And it would express that shape in the sort of bed of pins. So the same idea here was basically that you could basically make a kiln bed that was perforated, that had these pins in it. And if you could essentially program them so that each had a different height, you could then sort of introduce those. And what that would allow you to do would be to load the kiln with all this raw glass cut to length, bring it up to temperature, and as soon as it started tacking together, you would just turn on the bed and the form would be introduced dynamically at the exact same rate that the glass was bending. So it was constantly supported. You didn't have to stop in the whole middle of the process and anneal the thing down to room temperature, put it on another mold, and then bring it all back. So cut out like, a day, 2 days, 2.5 days of kiln cycle time out of the middle. And you just went from the end of the first sort of stage straight into the second stage.
Right, and it was something that would start out flat, and then you, as you mentioned, at a certain point when the glass was moving, then you would start to lower the pins, or the pins would be lowered automatically.
No, you'd actually raise the pins.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Flat, and then you start sort of growing the pins, and the topography is kind of introduced to the underside.
Got it.
And it's annealed.
And that's done through you can actually create a model, right? That this like the pins you described from the parents' coffee table, it would be pushed against to the exact tolerances.
Yeah, like I cut my hand in the studio and got an operation, and it wasn't that terrible, and they used the thermoplastic where they make these temporary molds for your hands. And I was looking at it and I was like, oh, that would be great for sculpting. And so I would start to buy this thermoplastic in sheets, and I'd cut it up, I'd make it warm, and then I'd just kind of bend it into these shapes that I liked, and then I would put it into a scale model of this kiln bed, essentially just a piece of acrylic with a whole bunch of little pins, and I'd set it over the little form I had made, And then I just had a little ruler and I'd measure each pin, and then I'd scale it up and, transfer that measurement to the pins under this. And that's essentially all that's going on.
Mm.
There's a
Mhm.
lot more complexity. It's motorized, all this stuff, but it's really just like, like they used to do in the 19th century when they'd scale up a maquette that a sculptor made of
Yeah.
a head.
Yeah.
You look at quadrant A5 and you make a big quadrant A5 and you same idea.
Yeah, but you actually had servos that would like raise and lower each individual pin according to
Well,
coordinates.
no, we never actuated all the pins individually. So that big flat
Mm.
thing underneath that you see there is called a platen, and that would rise, and every pin had a stop collar set at a particular height. So you were only actuating a single element, and it would carry all 300 or 350 little
Mm.
rods, but at different moments. So it was very smart in that it simplified what could have been a wildly complicated sort of moment where you had to orchestrate all the pins at just the right time individually. No, yeah. So the concept I came up with, and then I worked with Fred Metz, who really figured out how the hell to build it. I mean, he was a genius in that respect. And so, a lot like the mold blowing, right? Like I had this idea and I kind of imagined how it would work. And I started trying to find people who could help affect it.
Right. But who could help realize the concept that you yourself had developed? So,
Yeah.
it's like a collaborative, but also, it's so cool that you shared about the thermoplastic from your broken or wounded hand. That's really cool that you noticed the opportunity that it provided as well. So technology continued. I mean, so this is how like the Frank Gehry work was created through this type of process. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after it, we started Frankensteining it, like, because subsequently once I did that, I was like, oh, I wish I could do this, and that. And so we started drilling holes in the kiln and running cables through it, and essentially allowing us to kind of lift and pull different parts of these fused bodies remotely like a marionette.
Mm.
So, right, because you always wanted to just reach inside and stop something from falling farther or grab an edge and pull it over. And we started building these more complex pulley systems with cables and weights so that we could kind of essentially put our hands inside and do what we wanted to do, but it was all
Ah.
done remotely. So we used to have all these crazy pulleys and weight systems pulling on different parts of the glass at different rates. So we kept working with this kiln for a very long time and kind of doing firings where half of it was the kiln bed driving it to a certain form, and then we'd take over with the marionette system and pull it and sort of continue it, right? It was basically a way of getting around the fundamental problem of undercuts, where,
Yeah.
that's why slumped stuff always looks slumped, is because it can only go so far.
That's so interesting.
And so as
Also,
yeah,
sorry, also introducing like the gesture and the spontaneity in it as well, right? I mean, it's really interesting that you needed to
yeah,
get in there, yeah, at the time. Mhm.
and that was something that, like, I usually don't get that involved in theory, but that was a big part of Sarah's work.
Mhm.
That he felt like if you wanted it to look like it was bending over or curling or torquing, that the way you formed it had to kind of imbue the piece with that energy, that the process you were using to create it had to have that sense of movement and tension. And to some extent that's true here, right? Like the danger of the slump stuff is that it always looks like it's passively formed. And so this was an effort to at some point reach into the kiln and haul it over and finish the gesture, sort of.
Mm. That's interesting knowing where you went with this because that it becomes so gestural, right? Like, I mean, the Berlin project is impressive in many ways and really works so well with the architecture, but you really kind of ran with the gesture as your work evolved over time, and that's so interesting to hear that you really wanted to get that access even after you had worked out this technical process. You felt you needed to take it further in order to make it not so technical looking, right? In a way. That's fascinating. So here's an example of a machine that you guys developed. This is jumping around chronologically. This is not the next step by any means, but maybe you can just tell me a little bit about this as an example of how technology comes into play in your practice.
This is a machine that we built recently. a lot of work that a guy named Jonah Burns
Ça,
did in my shop. Where I, I've sort of developed it very different than the fuse stuff. I now build these sort of flexible textiles where you have a whole bunch of tubes that are associated with. It's essentially like weaving glass, so you're creating warps and wefts. And it's kind of an exploded loom, so this doesn't do every step in the weaving, but it's one part of it where we have these cross weaves that go on the glass, and we wanted to make grooves in each tube where the weave could settle and not move. And that's something that we've been wanting to do for a very long time, and obviously it's a very specialized thing because you have to have all the grooves, kind of formed the same way, but I started making more and more complex shapes where we'd use computer output to cut all the glass to one-off lengths. And then we wanted these cross weaves to kind of follow the length of the glass. So you're having to evenly divide it. So this is based on like pasta and pastry dividers where they have these simple sort of accordion mechanisms, and then they have a cutting wheel attached to it. So if you roll out a big thing of dough or dough, pastas, croissant, you can then sort of expand this little cutter to the width of whatever you're cutting, and it automatically, because those are all associated, subdivides it equally. So we use that idea here where instead of pastry cutters attached to it, there's a piston that actuates a torch that comes down to the glass and heats it up. Then it withdraws, and a tool comes down that sculpts the groove into the glass. And this is happening across 4 or 5 heads all simultaneously, where it's like 2.2 seconds of heat, withdraw, 3 seconds of sculpting pressure. So there's a whole like little dedicated computer brain that manages all the timing. But on a very basic level, you're just putting an implement at the nose of each one of these occurrences, and then you can make 4 grooves, 5 grooves simultaneously on a glass tube, and it automatically, if you have stops at the end of that mechanism, so you can move it with each tube and just sort of snug it up, it automatically subdivides it. So then when you lay all the tubes out, you get these cross weave grooves that follow the shape of glass. It's essentially, I was after something like what you see in nature, right? Like stripes on the belly of a fish, where when, as the fish goes like this and you got the dorsal fin, the stripes grow and they follow the form, so that, the idea was here that the structural detailing was directly related to the shape and the length and the qualities of the thing. So it looked like it was part of it as opposed to just something that was applied to it. And that's something I'm always trying to do, struggling with, is trying to make it look like the parts of the sculptures that are working and performing are kind of integral to the way the thing's imagined or aestheticized, that it's all part of the same thing. It's not like this is what I wanted to make and this is what I used to hold it up. It's more like how it's made is how it's how it's held up, and it's also part of how it looks, and it's all the same animal.
Right. It's all integrated in that way. I just wanted to point out really quickly that thank you for that explanation, which I think probably a percentage of us could follow. And I was not one of them fully. But in any case, I was going to say that this is not something you can buy anywhere. This is something that you guys actually physically built. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this is something that we spent, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 months developing, like 20, 30 iterations. And, it's become a lot more possible. We've really, as you were saying, we got very into certain software packages very early on, and also into, laser cutting and 3D printing and all that. So the time we started wanting to do this, we had a bunch of tools where we could like iterate incredibly quickly. So we could try a version of the machine one night, and this part should be like that. This should be a little longer. Boom, you come in the next morning, you have another piece. And so it's made it very, this is less about what we're capable of than just sort of like a moment where we wouldn't have been able to iterate and make such unique, highly specialized machines that satisfy one super particular sort of use case that only I need. Like you couldn't do that years ago, but now you can.
And you couldn't even like economically afford to build such a machine, right? I mean, like it's only because you have access to these parts and you have a team, right? And you mentioned this to me earlier.
Yeah.
I thought was very interesting that the people who work with you are, obviously Fred Metz, legendary in the field for furnaces and studio technologies, but you continue to kind of like feed with these incredible employees who you hire from places like Apple or like rocket propulsion
Yeah.
research, or other types of people with really incredible skill sets, but who also want to be creative, not just to work in a large corporation, but to do something kind of groundbreaking. Is that an important part of your practice as well as this technology?
Yeah, it's a huge part of it. And I think the draw is that that interest is integral to everything we do and to the work. So it's um like investing in developing the tools that you need to make the ideas that you imagine, that's the integrity of the whole enterprise, right? Like I sort of
Yeah,
so that's
yeah.
what I mean when I say people as tools. Like sometimes we solve it mechanically in an old school like machinist way. Sometimes we solve it in a very quant way. Like this was for the project we did in Manila, where years of developing these custom scripts. So this is just Rhino, but Rhino using Grasshopper, which is a sort of secondary layer of automating. So you can have it sort of you can create a script that it uses to perform all the actions on the actual commands in the CAD, and it can get quite complicated. Like so, in this case, we're using it to create an apparently random pattern of striping in the surface of the glass. This particular piece had tubes of the same diameter, but they all had different little prismatic lineations on the inside. So we had a six fluted tube, a 12 fluted tube, and an 18 fluted tube, each represented by these different colors. And with these little sliders that you see on the right, we could choose how randomized that pattern was. We could designate an area in that strip of glass that ran from the bottom of the atrium to the top, where it was like clearer at the bottom, made up of
Hmm.
tubes with fewer flutes, and much more opaque tubes with
Yeah,
more flutes at the top. And so it gives, essentially what it does is it gives you the ability to apply all these unique solutions to every tube in a way that you could never track or create as a one-off thing. So, we do that, and then this thing kicks out a cut list for every tube based on the overall shape of the piece, and it
yeah.
includes which type of tube it is and how deep a radius it has and which molding
Right.
it formed on. So it's that's what I mean when I say metabolizing a design.
Hmm.
We'll come up with an idea and we'll make it, and then we'll go in here and we'll start playing with these custom tools that help you control the transparency and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and then kick out all the actionable sort of recipes that you need to actually cut it and form.
Right. So they were taking this is a very deep dive into the back end of what's happening behind the scenes, but I think it's so important to because we'll be getting to the results of this all, which are breathtaking and just visually splendid. But to understand what went into it, I think is so fascinating because this technology, Rhino's been around for a while, but to the degree it can process intricacy at this level, and then with Grasshopper as well, which is allowing you to understand the components and the inventory you need to achieve that result. Is that correct? If a really layman explanation of what you're doing
Yeah,
there with
and
Grasshopper? Yeah.
interestingly, we were in the first wave of Rhino users because Gary's office told us to get it so that we could look at the complicated shapes that he was developing, because
Mhm.
the other software packages could express all those asymmetries and weird stuff.
Mhm.
We got in with Rhino very early because he told us.
Again, back to that Gehry connection that did so much. It's interesting you mentioned that about the people who work for you, the machines and everything, because I think of to move this to a very hands-on and completely manual side of things. Like Lino Tagliapietra is a master, a maestro, widely hailed as the best glassblower in the world. But his work is a product of a team, and this team of people have all been studied and tutored and apprenticed alongside him to learn the way he does things and are extensions of him, but also bring unique skill sets. So when I see the angel tier, it's not just Lino, it's the team. It's all the work that went into training and all the dreams and, inspiration of all these people represented, and the fact that they were all together at this moment to make this piece. It's like a record of, it's not just, the work, it's a record of a moment in time when all these things came together. And I think that very much applies to your work as well. And here we see it, kind of materialized in these machines and these people and in these programs, all of which converge to create what we're about to see next, which is some of the results of this incredible work. But before we get into actually seeing a bit more of the work, I wanted to just talk also about inspiration. We saw a lot about technology and technique and machinery, but what about the sources of what you're after, where you get this vision that you're using all this machinery to achieve? And from our conversations and from looking at the work, clearly nature is a major inspiration. I would like you, if you could, to talk a little bit about, what you look at, how you see, and how you take apart visually things that we are so familiar with in nature, or, in this case, it's from 1899. It's the Ernst Haeckel, intricate drawing that he did, peering through a microscope, when just, appreciation for evolution was just popularizing in Europe. He's a German, scientist, researcher, really, who would take, publicize the intricacy of nature because he had access to microscopes that allowed him to replicate what often are very fine details that are repeated in order to create, coral, in this case, the intricacies of coral. But can you talk a little bit about how your work relates to the natural world and where your sources of inspiration come from?
Yeah, and he was also great at just also sort of distilling the essential geometries. I mean, repetition, as you say, but also the kind of fundamental shapes. And I think that was because, right, he was drawing it, so you kind of had to choose what you were going to pay attention to, and sort of render that out of what you're looking at and express it a little bit more clearly. And like when I was a kid, I used to do scuba diving a lot, and I thought I was going to be an oceanographer, and I worked in the Museum of Natural History a little bit, and then later in high school, I spent a summer out at Scripps. And I eventually realized that it wasn't the science of the ocean that interested me, despite the fact that I've remained very interested in technology. It was the shapes and the colors, and that's, and maybe that's why the Shiner organic thing, caught my ear.
Okay.
But I've always been very interested in that, but like the one thing I'd say about the Shiner exercise and that sort of through current in my work, is that I was never interested in this is going to sound weird. I was never interested in the particular forms of nature. I was interested in the fundamental shapes of nature. So I wasn't trying to like render a particular squash or, the shape of this particular thing. I was more looking at like how lobed forms in nature happen or how branching happens, much more sort of higher level, general sort of uniform standards where you can, the way arteries branch is the way rivers branch, and you can find those commonalities. And in a lot of it's not a one-to-one by any means, but in a lot of the work that I do, I'm sort of looking for that. I talked about this at the beginning. Like I find that the sculptures that are successful are the ones where I can kind of intuit a system and a natural order, where you can say like, oh, this is built of hexagons that pack.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth side is half the width of the second side, and that's the part of nature that I'm interested in. And in that way, it's very, I don't know how you Haeckel, it's very Haeckelian,
Yeah.
that you sort of look at the world and you try and sort of like, how the hell am I going to draw this thing? What are its fundamental qualities?
We have a little bit of video here showing some of your work being, disassembled or unpacked or packed. And I just, you get a sense of the structure here that we're talking about and the repeated elements and the way that curves and things behave in these connected forms. Sorry for the volume here.
Joseph, more?
Yeah, watch your lamp. Watch your lamp.
Okay, everybody up.
Yeah, so like the thing that's great about this was, I got interested in glass because it was hot and you could stretch it, and it was all that plasticity. And that's everything that most of the world doesn't get about glass, right? Because they're always touching it when it's cold. They think of it shattering. So, especially when wanted to start making bigger shapes that related to buildings, I was always trying to get back to that fluidity. And that's part of why these flexible structures happened was I was trying to figure out like how could you sculpt stuff at room temperature? Oh, by associating it mechanically, that's where you got the flexibility such that you could bring it into a shape. And if you wanted to move it a little over here or spread it out a little there, this is what would allow you to do it. And, like this particular video, we were literally just like hot sculpting it overseas in the room when we unpacked it. You'd just sort of lay out bolts of fabric and then you'd pull them into shape. That was basically me just trying to get back to the furnace on some level.
That's so interesting. And then the resilience that can come from this form. We have a short video here.
I just want you to see how much the cable's arrested. This is probably the one thing that you can model pretty easily in your simulator.
So yeah, we see exactly, I know you're showing some other aspects, but here you just see how strong this is.
Yeah, this wasn't me trying to convince someone like it's seismically robust.
You mentioned that it meets the code for areas that are earthquake prone. It can be installed in lobbies of hotels in Asia where there might be really strict requirements. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and at scale. That's the key. Like as soon as things get big, that's when you have to start worrying about how they're gonna, if it's the size of a table or a chair, who cares? But if it's the size of a whole facade or series of columns, you really have to make sure that it's structurally sound.
And then here's just another video that has sort of like this sense of the shape and the flex of the glass. We're going to have to accelerate it a little bit. I mean, I love this conversation, Nikolas, and I appreciate so much the detail. I'm also looking at the clock, and we're going to kind of wind it up pretty quickly. So we can look at some of the finished works before our time runs out here. Maybe you can just quickly give me like a kind of a year and a kind of ideas that drove this piece in particular, which looks like a residential skylight.
Yeah, it was a divider between the living room and the dining room, and so we decided to punch a hole in the ceiling and kind of make light the central focus of the living room. So this is basically a glass box with the sculptural form inside of it. And it changes pretty dramatically day to night, but it's all illuminated from the same source. So day, sun comes down, night, artificial light comes down, same path.
Cool.
And then we sometimes do some of the architecture. So in this case, we included this plinth that it kind of lands on or floats above.
Yeah, and there's the repetition as well as the flex and the arc. Yeah. Beautiful the way it connects also to the sun, right? And the natural world, and it brings in the light down into the space. Sort of like an oculus, yeah. I'm always struck by the lightness that you achieve, like glasses, it's known for visually being possibly light, but you create like a really convincing impression. Like in this case, it looks like it's floating, right? But often in your work, it doesn't seem to have weight at all, Yeah, very nice. Nice connection from inside and outside. Yeah, so this is a quick. If you're interested in this conversation, we're going to just show you a really quick little note about the magazine. This is building off of the cover article in the current edition of Glass. It's a little tour of the current issue. If you found this conversation interesting and you'd like to learn more, you can find out more about the magazine through this short break. So if you're interested in subscribing to Glass, we have a special offer for viewers of this Glass Quarterly Live. There's a special code GQ Live. And if you enter that when you order the magazine, you will get this current issue for free, learn a lot more about Nikolas Weinstein and his practice. So if you enter that code, we'll send you the issue with Nikolas Weinstein on the cover, and you will get 4 more issues over the course of the next year. Grove, it's called. It's in Quezon City, which is north of Manila. It's part of the Manila metropolitan area. It's an 87-foot tall glass sculpture, more than 100 feet in depth. It was certified by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest glass tube installation in the world. It has metal spines, and it's based on the form of the mangrove tree. So here's a view looking down on it from one of the many floors that are around this massive lobby atrium. And yeah, this is probably the most scaffolding I've ever seen in one place, in one density, as the actual structure was being installed. And I'm sorry to accelerate through this, Nikolas. I'm just cognizant of the time. We're pretty low on time, but just if you could quickly talk about the panels that we see here, as this was installed by a team of people on site, and through these 2 metal helix sort of structures. How many pieces are there, and how much does this project weigh in total?
It's about 13, 14 tons. And it's got about 17,000 tubes in it, every single one unique. And they were broken down into these, what we called ventlets, but they were essentially like little manageable panels. I forget how many there were. I think about 450 or 500 ventlets. And those kind of had the 36 tubes, and they were on these little racks that kind of included all the particular torque and twist and curve of that particular spot in the sculpture, such that they could kind of just plug in. So here you see one of the small ventlets being lifted into place, and then they would get woven on site. So there were sort of towards the end, there were about 40 to 50 people up in the rigging, sort of weaving this thing all over into place. And so
with steel cable.
With aircraft cable, correct.
Okay. Aluminum, is it steel or aluminum?
Stainless steel.
Stainless steel, yeah. And you barely can see the wires, but obviously it needs some kind of support, and you can just barely make out the wires from the ceiling. But it just has such incredible impact. And as you said, as we saw from the grasshopper rhino demo there, the way the light is hitting it here, you can see the variation. And this is intentional. You were saying this is achieved through a fluting of the interior of the tube. Is that right?
Yeah, it's that sort of texture that you're seeing on the skin of the sculpture are those varying tube configurations.
And the mangrove tree is known, it's native to the Philippines, and it's known for its resilience and its ability to grow in really punishing conditions of salt water and tropical sun and incredible humidity. And why was it chosen for this particular project?
I was interested in it because it's basically in some way like an open network skyscraper, right? It's part of the reason why they survive in those transitional sort of natural zones is because they have a very broad base that's an open network that allows them to anchor in the sandy sort of low waters and still have sort of water pass through them without sort of bending them over. So it has a lot of structural qualities that when you're trying to build something really tall that doesn't feel massive become pretty important. Yeah, it's really an extraordinary. And is this the largest project you've ever built? I don't know if I'd say it's definitely the largest as an enterprise. I mean, there were a couple of others that we did that were pretty big. They were long and horizontal. This one's definitely unique in being half standing and half suspended. We have some other views of it here in different lighting conditions. And it's just, all the things that we discussed. I mean, the technical intricacy meets this incredible gestural. I mean, it's almost hard to believe that it's glass, right? It looks like fabric. It looks like it's fabric mid-flight as it's being, as it's wafting down from somewhere, which is so beautiful about your work, is the ability to create this sense of
glass as flowing, ethereal, billowing, just fabric-like, gossamer type of effect with something like glass, which is the only thing that can do things with light like what we see in these pictures. It's really, it's really inspiring, and it's really breathtaking, and an incredible accomplishment. So wanted to thank you, Nikolas, so much for taking the time with us today. We are unfortunately running out of time on this beautiful presentation. There's a couple of additional slides I was thinking about showing, but at this point, we're just so grateful for the amount of time you gave us today. So thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and for being on Glass Quarterly Live. And best of luck. What is your next project? What are you guys working on at the moment?
We're working on a project right now in Hong Kong for a residence. And we're also just beginning a project actually in the New York area for a hospital.
Oh, wow. Amazing. So we'll stay tuned on that. Well, once again, thank you for the magazine article. Thank you for this Glass Quarterly Live, and best of luck with advancing the frontiers of what glass can do. It's most impressive.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.